Now our next example, I want to stick to the fundamentals. If we're asked what is the square root of 9 over 16, my answer is going to be 3 over 4. But not automatically because square root of 9 is square root of 16. Remember that if I'm asked what is the square root of 25, what I'm going to say is 5. Because 5 squared is what gives me 25, is what gives me my radicand. The reason square root of 9 over 16 is 3 over 4 is because if I have 3 over 4 squared, remember if I take 3 over 4 times 3 over 4, if I have a fraction times itself, remember how I multiply fractions, top times top, bottom times bottom, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16. It's that 9 over 16 that is my radicand. It's the 3 over 4 that is my principal root. Now for my next example, what if I have a negative coefficient? What if I have negative square root of 64? Well, remember what a negative coefficient means. A negative in front means negative 1 times. It's not even going to affect my radical. Negative 1 times, when I look at what's the square root of 64? Well, the square root of 64 is 8, because 8 squared is what gives me the 64. Negative 1 times 8 is negative 8. Well, what if I have a negative underneath the radical? Negative underneath the radical, I want to say 8 because there's nothing negative in front, but the problem is 8 squared gives me 64. That's not my negative 64, so that's not my principal root. Well, what if I had a negative 8 squared thing? Negative 8 times negative 8, problem is that gives me a positive 64 also. The problem here is that nothing squared gives me a negative number. If you go back to one of the things that we mentioned earlier, and we'll even expand on this, when we talked about our rational expressions, we had 2 rules. When we were talking about our domain, we were saying no zeros allowed in the denominator. That's what gave us the restrictions that we talked about back on that unit 2 on day 4. But the other rule, and I didn't expand on it much, I said no negatives underneath square roots. Well, let's expand that just a little bit more here in a minute. We aren't allowed to have negative numbers under square roots. The problem is positive numbers squared give me a negative. Negative numbers squared give me a negative. What we call here is that this is a not real solution. Which then leads the question, what is a real number? A real number is any number you can think of. Any positive number, any negative number, any decimal, any fraction. 0 is a real number. 1 is a real number. Pi is a real number. Square root of 2 is a real number. Any number that we've ever known in our life, anything that we can put on a number line is a real number. The only thing that's not going to be real, and we'll cover this towards the end of this unit, is the number I. And we'll talk about it. It's a whole different set of numbers all by itself. Moral of the story, I'm not allowed to have a negative underneath, and we'll expand on this definition here in just a minute. Now, when I have a negative radicand with a square root, what I say is not real.